So we're going to talk today about the fall of Rome. What is it that brought about the collapse of this great civilization? It's generally agreed that Rome fell in the year 476 AD. That's the year historians always point to. That's when you actually have a barbarian who's ruling as emperor over the Romans. But it's also generally agreed that the problems Rome faced had started much earlier. And we can talk about two different types of problems. One are internal problems, things happening within the empire. Skepticism being the big underlying problem. Because the big thing Rome stood for, the big thing classical civilization, going back to the Greeks, stood for, is the idea that the world can be made sense of. You can understand the world. You can get knowledge of the world. Skepticism says we can't know. We can't understand the world. It's really flying in the face of what classical civilization was all about. Here you have Pyrrho, he's the father of the Pyrrhonian skeptics, saying, no, we can't know anything. Knowledge is impossible. Well, then what about all the work of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Thucydides? What about all this talk about making sense of the world? Why do we do that anymore? And then there's going to be disputes about land, a more practical problem. And there's political instability coming about, and economic decline. It's connected with all of these things, as we'll see. And then there's going to be problems on the frontier with foreign invasions. And then there's the spread of Christianity. Those are the external problems. The spread of Christianity is going to be happening within Rome, but it's really a foreign thing. It's a worldview that is coming within Rome, but it's not Roman. The Roman worldview is really in contrast to, in conflict with, the Christian worldview, and it's hard for them to coexist. If somebody's converting to Christianity, then they're no longer believing in that Roman worldview. So land disputes brought about the collapse of the Republic. That was at least one of the central factors. The senators had become greedy, and other wealthy people, but particularly talking about senators as the rich. They become greedy. They were using slave labor to do farming at a much cheaper rate than most other farmers could do it at, and so they're able to sell their food at a rate that others just can't compete with. So other farmers are forced to sell their land at low prices while the senators just get richer and richer and get more and more land. So by 133 BC, the Roman Republic was divided. They'd conquered pretty much everything. All of their enemies had been defeated. And so now you just have greed cropping up. And you have a person, Tiberius Gracchus, calling for reform. He wants a redistribution of land in Rome, which is going to mean taking land away from these wealthy senators and redistributing it to some of the people who used to have land and have now become poor, and many of them have had to give up their land entirely. And because the wealthy senators are the ones who are the ones you got to convince, and they're supposedly the ones who are ruling Rome by way of discussion, not by way of just brute force, this is who Tiberius Gracchus has to go to. But you can see it'd be hard to convince the rich to get rid of their own riches. Now, you're not supposed to have any weapons within the Senate, because it's supposed to be, again, a place for discussion and rational discourse, and we rule that way. So, since they don't have weapons, they tear the legs off of their chairs and beat Tiberius Gracchus to death. This is a big sign that the Senate is no longer able to govern. They are now ruling just like the Etruscans, who they had rebelled against so many centuries earlier. The Etruscans, they felt, were ruling like dictators, ruling through brute force. Well, now that's how the senators are ruling. It's evident that the senators are no longer able to govern. Rome is going to be in a state of turmoil for the next 100 years. And it's going to be Julius Caesar who's the one who really sees that it's the military that has the power now. And he's going to do something illegal. He's going to take his military force that's ruling over in the Germanic lands, trying to conquer territory for Rome there. He's going to cross the Rubicon. over into the Italian lands, which he's not allowed to do. You're not allowed to take your army outside of the realm that you were given to use that army in. But he's going to cross over, and now he either has to conquer Rome or he's going to be executed as a criminal. Well, he's successful in conquering Rome, and he's going to begin an empire. The Republic is over. You're now going to be ruled by one man. But the mistake he makes is not realizing just how much the Romans really prized their traditions. They like the idea of the Senate, and they don't like the idea of dictatorship. And so Julius Caesar is going to be assassinated, and a new emperor will come about, Octavius. And Octavius sees that you got to make it at least look like you're being ruled by the Senate. So he's going to be emperor, but not officially. He's not going to be officially titled the dictator of Rome. Rather, he'll have his titles placed in such a way that, it looks like at least the Senate still has some power. And he's going to establish stability for the empire for about the next 200 years. But Christopher Dawson raises some question about how stable really were things. Was it really stable or just the appearance of it? As he says, in the 2nd century, under the wise rule of the great Flavian and Antonine emperors, this movement of expansion of the empire attained its full development. Never had the ancient world seemed more prosperous, more civilized, or more peaceful. Rome seemed to have realized the Stoic ideal of a world state in which all men should live at peace with one another under the rule of a just and enlightened monarchy. Yet appearances are deceptive. All this brilliant expansion of urban civilization had in it the seeds of its own decline. It was an external and superficial development. He's saying Rome appeared to be doing so well, but under the surface, they were not doing well at all. The same problems that had existed before Julius Caesar came to power, the same problems that were faced in the Republic are still there under the empire. They haven't been resolved. So long as the empire was expanding, the system paid its way. For every new war resulted in fresh territories to urbanize and new supplies of cheap slave labor. But as soon as the process of expansion came to an end and the empire was forced to stand on the defensive against new barbarian invasions, the economic balance was destroyed. The resources of the empire began to diminish, while its expenditure continued to increase. In other words, as they're expanding, they can steal territory from the people that they're conquering. They can take that land and give it to their soldiers as pay. They can take the wealth from this land and they can spread it around Rome. And so there's always new wealth coming in, and the economy is always having some sort of vibrancy brought in by the expansion and theft and spreading of wealth in this way. Well, when that comes to an end, now instead of expanding, what they have to do is defend. And the reason why this happens is they eventually reach the end of civilized people to conquer, and now there's just these barbarians on the frontier, and there's no benefit to conquering them. They don't have any wealth that you can gain. They don't even live in cities. And now these barbarians, instead of being invaded, are going to be the people invading the Romans and stealing the Roman stuff. And they're going to be terrorizing people on the frontier. And now you're going to have to raise taxes because you got to pay in order to put more troops on the frontier to defend against these barbarians. And you're also going to face the Persian Empire over in the east, which is very powerful, and they're going to be going to war and competing over various territories, and that's going to be expensive also. So they're going to have a bigger empire. So eventually you're going to have the 3rd century crisis. In this century, there's emperors trying to defend on the frontiers, but there's people attacking from so many places, the emperors aren't able to be everywhere that they need to be. So their generals, in many cases, are going to be the ones to fight off barbarian armies. And when that happens, they're soldiers are going to be so happy with these generals that they're going to decide to place them as the new emperors. Say, you have defended Rome. You're the new emperor. And then what do we do with the old emperor? We murder him. And then when it happens again, when a new general pops up, well, then you kill that emperor. Sometimes you'll have 4 emperors in 1 year. It just keeps happening over and over again because the frontiers are being threatened. And people are also wanting to move out of these frontiers because who wants to live right on the edge of where the barbarians are going to invade? So people are moving, and now you're losing Roman land, and barbarians are going to take that land. Well, then the frontier just moves back, and now people are going to want to move out of that land. So you have economic problems because the economy is shrinking, taxes are being raised to defend the empire. It's not a good situation. Eventually you'll have Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century who will come in and bring in reform. One thing that he does is he brings in the Tetrarchy. And with the Tetrarchy, you're going to have 4 emperors, 2 in the east, 2 in the west. A junior emperor will be under the senior emperor of the west, a junior emperor under the senior emperor of the east. It also is supposed to help with who's going to be the new emperor if an emperor dies, so you don't have civil war, because the junior emperor will automatically take the senior emperor's place if the senior emperor dies. And you see here in this image, this is kind of the ideal is these guys are all really close and they get along well, and so you're not going to have problems anymore within the empire. Well, it doesn't necessarily work out that way. These guys will be somewhat friendly and they're going to marry each other's daughters. You know, the senior emperor marry off his daughter to the junior emperor, and it's like one big happy family. But eventually they're going to end up going to war with each other because that's just how people act. Everybody wants to be the top guy in charge. If one guy steps out to try to be the person in charge, well, then the other one's going to have to defend, and then eventually it's just going to be every man for himself, and that's exactly what's going to happen. Now, he also tries to fix the problem of inflation. Inflation is where prices are increasing. He tries to fix that problem by creating a law of the maximum prices you can charge. Like if, say, one day bread costs $2 and the next day it costs $5 and the day after that it costs $25, well, that's a real problem. How do you afford to buy bread? Well, he just says, no more of that. No one can charge more than $2. Well, all that does, it makes it so that people don't want to sell their bread on the open market. They're going to sell it illegally for higher prices. You don't actually solve anything this way, but it was an attempt. See, he's not seeing the deeper problems within the empire. He's not seeing people don't believe in classical civilization like they once did. Those that had fought off the Persians, they believed deeply in the value of this civilization. They were willing to band together and fight for something that they loved. Well, it doesn't appear that people love the Roman Empire anymore. Classical civilization has been carried on by the Romans, but it's kind of fallen apart. It's not something people have great faith in, and many people are converting to Christianity now. Well, that's another part of his solution. Let's kill all the Christians. Christians had been persecuted at various times since their emergence in the 1st century. Well, now he decides, let's wipe them out entirely. Here we have an image of Christians being crucified and Christians about to be fed to these animals, to lions and tigers. And you would think perhaps that this sort of thing would work. Just keep killing them until they all agree to convert. Well, it doesn't work. He had thought, well, we'll just get these Christians, they'll all convert back to the Roman worldview, and then no more problems. People will believe in Rome like they once did, but it doesn't work, and eventually the effort to wipe out the Christians, they're going to have to give up on it. And in the Civil War, one man's going to come to power. That's going to be Constantine. At the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he'll gain his greatest victory. And in 313, shortly after this Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he's going to passed the Edict of Milan, which makes it so that Christians are no longer allowed to be persecuted. So that effort came to an end. Diocletian just hadn't seen the deeper problems in the empire and didn't know how to deal with them. Well, barbarian invasions are going to come. There will be stability for a time under Constantine. They'll be dealing with heresy within the empire. But eventually problems are going to pop up again in terms of barbarians invading. One of the big things will happen is there's going to be a big Battle of Adrianople of 378, where the barbarians actually defeat the Romans in battle. And this becomes a symbol for the Romans that, hey, these barbarians are actually able to beat us. And more importantly, it becomes a symbol for the barbarians that, hey, we can beat them. We don't have to just invade and conquer stuff. We can actually come in and conquer and live there. We can take over the Roman Empire. And over a period of about a century, that's what's going to happen, is you'll have barbarians just coming in and conquering more and more territory. Here is an image of one of these periods where Rome is the city of Rome is actually attacked. This is when it's attacked by the Vandals in the year 455. This is the worst of the sackings. The earlier one of 410 was not nearly so violent. They didn't steal nearly so much stuff. But when the Vandals come in, they take pretty much anything that's not nailed down. And it's just a symbol that the Romans aren't able to defend themselves anymore. The barbarian invasions, though, are really just the tip of the iceberg. The underlying problem had to do with the worldview that the Roman people just simply no longer valued. It wasn't something that unified them. It wasn't something they were willing to fight for. It didn't inspire them. So as Christopher Dawson says, Christianity appealed to all those who failed to find satisfaction in the existing order, the poor and the oppressed, the underprivileged classes, above all, those who revolted against the spiritual emptiness and corruption of the dominant material culture, and who felt the need of a new social order and a religious view of life. And so it became the focus of the forces of disaffection and opposition to the dominant culture in a far more fundamental sense than any movement of political or economic discontent. It was a protest not against material injustice, but against the spiritual ideals of the ancient world. The Christians are really just coming out against something that people are already dissatisfied with. There's already this dissatisfaction with this old worldview that says worship many gods, and this attempt to make sense of the world in a deeper way through philosophy, through deep thinking, in the theater, in art, in all the ways that classical civilization shows this expression of a yearning for knowledge, that all of that's falling apart. And the Christians aren't the problem. The Christians are coming in and they are converting people to a new worldview in the midst of people who are dissatisfied with the Roman worldview. So you can't fix that just by killing the Christians. The empire had alienated the strongest and most living forces in the life of the age, and it was this internal contradiction, far more than war or external invasion, that caused the downfall of ancient civilization. Before ever the barbarians had broken into the empire, and before the economic breakdown had taken place, the life had passed out of the city-state, and the spirit of classical civilization was dying. So classical civilization was dying. The cities were still being built with their temples and statues and theaters, as in the Hellenistic age, but it was a sham facade that hid the decay within. The future lay with the infant church. So it's the church that is offering a worldview that people are finding some sort of new hope in. So, yeah, the barbarian invasions were important, but they're not the underlying cause of the collapse of this Roman civilization. The underlying cause had to do with the loss of faith in the worldview. And Christopher Dawson is historian who is pointing that out. Now, there's a more philosophical level to look at this, a deeper level to look at this. In this book, Philosophical Foundation, we have this come out. You can see in this statement the importance of a system. Philosophy is a system, a world and life view. A worldview attempts to make sense of all aspects of human existence as a coherent whole, building upon the foundation. Differing cultures are expressions of differing worldviews. What makes sense rationally in one worldview may not make sense in another, given differing starting points. Culture wars are the expression of deeper philosophical issues which are seldom discussed. While worldviews differ, they share formal similarities as worldviews. In every worldview, there are basic beliefs about epistemological authority, about what is real, and about the good. These are rationally connected and together are used to interpret, give meaning to one's experience. In seeking to make sense of the world, each view aims at rational coherence. So, in other words, everybody has a worldview. Everybody has a view of the world, which is like what we call religion, where we try to make sense of the world, and this is how we really view everything in light of our worldview. If I'm a Roman, I'm looking at the world in light of the gods and in light of Stoic philosophy, and I'm thinking back to Plato and trying to make sense of everything in light of all these underlying philosophical ideals that are taught in so many different ways. And if I can't make sense of the world through these things, if, say, the idea of fate doesn't make sense to me, you say, oh, everything's fated. Well, if everything's fated, then why do I need to make any great effort? You say, well, it's fated, but it's fated through what you do. Well, if it's fated through what I do, does that mean it's not really fated? And are the gods in charge? And if they are, does it really matter what I do? These are the kind of questions that pop up in people's minds, and it really starts to raise question about what is the value of this worldview that I'm holding to, and the gods that they believe in are just as empty and dissatisfied as their rulers. They seem to be just all about power. Just like the senators who are using slave labor to gain wealth for themselves and don't seem really concerned about the people that they're ruling over, the gods don't seem concerned either. They just want to go to war and get glory. Well, why would you want to put any value in that? Why would you want to live for, fight for, die for a civilization like that? Why would that bring people together? Worldviews are developed in individuals and cultures over time. They are held more or less consciously and consistently and are subject to challenges of reason by those who stand inside or outside the worldview. So, in other words, worldviews will be tested and challenged. If the worldview is inadequate to the task of supporting a coherent worldview, meaning in the culture, if the culture diminishes, divisions will appear. With the decrease of meaning, there's an increase in hedonic excess to fill the emptiness of life, meaning people are going to just look for fulfillment in things they can find for themselves outside of the civilization. Just seek pleasure and enjoyment, no longer willing to make sacrifices for the sake of a civilization that they don't believe in, a worldview that they don't believe in, and then cultural decay sets in, and eventually cultural collapse. Many cultures in world history have collapsed after centuries of such challenges. Those that remain are not now so promising. So what we have here with the collapse of Rome is something we can continue to look at today. Intellectual apathy, weariness, and cynicism are the prevailing mood today. People no longer seem to think that knowledge is really possible. Well, if it's not, then why live for any particular civilization? Why stand for any particular worldview? This mood of skepticism, of intellectual apathy, is one of the things that brought Rome down. And this mood presents a new level of intellectual challenge for us in our own day. and calls for a deeper level of philosophical response. If we don't get down to that root level of skepticism and address that question, is knowledge actually possible? Then will it be possible for us to continue as a civilization? Many civilizations in the past have collapsed. Is there any reason to think ours will be an exception? Only if we address these underlying causes that lead to the collapse of a civilization should we expect to face anything different. We will become divided. We will face this hedonic excess where people are seeking pleasure and they end up fighting amongst each other, face civil war, face external problems. So the underlying message that we get from looking at the collapse of Rome is that we got to look at our own house, look at our own lives, not just a civilization, but within a family, within an individual. What's going to keep me alive? What's going to keep my family alive? What's going to keep life in a person, in a family, in a civilization? That's going to come from answering basic questions, beginning with the most basic question: is knowledge possible? And if so, how? That was a question that had been raised in classical culture, but wasn't really resolved. So we got to go further. We got to make sure to actually resolve these things. Otherwise, we'll end up in the same situation. The collapse might not happen in the same way, but America will collapse, the West will collapse, every civilization will collapse, and certainly don't want that for ourselves, for our family. If we have any value in our civilization, we'd like to see it revive and thrive. Thank you.